Well, on now to another ceasefire, this one teetering on the brink. Israel has warned that its renewed assault on Gaza is only the beginning.
The Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu promising the new offensive will continue until the country achieves all of its war objectives.
Israel will fight, and Israel will win. We will bring our people home, and we will destroy Hamas. We will not relent until we achieve all these vital goals. And we will not rest until we give our country a future of peace, prosperity, and hope.
Loud blasts were heard across Gaza as Israel restarted its offensive, leaving at least 400 people dead and more than 500 injured. Mr. Netanyahu said that any further ceasefire negotiations will take place under fire. He added that he ordered the bombardment against Hamas due to its refusal to release more hostages, a rejection of longer-term truce proposals backed by the U.S.
Washington has confirmed Israel consulted President Trump before carrying out the attacks. It said the militant group was solely to blame for the resumption of hostilities. Hamas has condemned the latest strikes and accused Israel of putting the fate of the remaining captives in jeopardy. Some 59 Israeli hostages are still in Gaza, more than half of whom Israel believes to be dead. Thousands of civilians have fled their homes after Israel issued evacuation orders for several areas it deemed dangerous combat zones.
الدواء والحاجات الخفيفة، أما الحاجات الثانية ما قدرناش، ما فيش مواصلات وخليناها وجينا الآن جبنا الشيء الخفيف اللي قدرنا نشيله جبنا.
بدنا نعيش زي اللي عايشين بس مش أكتر. بدناش ولا شيء، لا بدنا خبز ولا بدنا ناكل ولا نشرب، بس نتهنى في عيشتنا.
Joining us now for more is Jonathan Panikoff, director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much for coming on today, Jonathan. Okay, so public opinion polls in Israel, they show there's widespread support for phase 2 of the ceasefire. Why then did Prime Minister Netanyahu decide to launch these fresh strikes? Was it the pressure from the far right, perhaps? Was it too much for him to withstand?
Well, thanks for having me. Good morning and great to be back with you. Look, I think that's the question a lot of Israelis are asking. I think there's two challenges here. One is clearly Prime Minister Netanyahu is under a significant amount of political pressure in order to keep the coalition together, in order to keep power. The reality was ultranationalists like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who rejoined the coalition, never wanted a ceasefire. The same is true with Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. But I think the bigger question really is, how is Israel going to move forward? At the end of the day, the big challenge is there's still no answer to security, to how Israel ends up having a secure border or how there's security in Gaza for the Palestinian people. And with Hamas being able to remain in power, that was never going to be an option. And so I think the Israelis wanted to try and have a slightly different ceasefire, a ceasefire that would have more hostages released. Obviously, that was going to reduce Hamas's really single point of leverage, and so they were not going to agree to it. They wanted to move on to phase 2 of the original ceasefire agreement of having all Israeli troops out. And so you got to a standstill, and that standstill, frankly, resulted in what was perhaps inevitable in the resumption, unfortunately, of this tragic war.
So, Jonathan, is the ceasefire truly over now, or is there still potential for it to be revived in any way?
Look, I'm as big an optimist as anybody. I would hope that it could be revived. I think it's pretty unlikely. I think in order for it to be revived quickly, you would need to see a new arrangement being made between Hamas and between Israel, and I just can't imagine that happening. The problem is the folks who are being negotiated with for Hamas in Doha are not always on the same page as the Hamas leadership in the Gaza Strip. We've seen this for a long time now, but even as you've seen a lot of the leadership be killed by the Israelis, it still continues to be true. And so now that the war has restarted, there's less incentive for Hamas and the Gaza Strip to be willing to say, yes, we'll make this brief and continue to have another ceasefire or reach another ceasefire. And I think for Israel, there's no great incentive. Originally, there was hope that maybe Prime Minister Netanyahu wanted to get through the budget in Israel, which would come end of this month, or maybe through the end of Ramadan, or maybe through the Passover holiday, which will happen mid next month. And none of that seemed to be the case. In the end, it seems to have been that the two sides just felt 2 months was enough. There weren't going to be more hostages released. And so I think we're at a point where the ceasefire really has collapsed.
On hostages, Jonathan, the Israeli leader says one of his war goals is to free all the remaining hostages. So help us understand how reigniting the war will enable him to achieve that. I mean, critics say what he's actually done now is put the hostages at even greater risk.
I think it's certainly true. Look, if we look at the number of hostages who've already died in captivity throughout the last now 18 months, it's hard not to think that, yes, the hostages' lives are now probably a greater risk. I think what Prime Minister Netanyahu's view is look, Hamas was not going to give up the only leverage it had remaining without additional pressure. In order to have pressure, that means having to actually resume the war, batter the leadership, batter Hamas fighters, reduce their numbers even more, and eventually they'll come back to the table. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think it's a bit of a misread, but I don't think it's a surprise. We haven't seen any great flexibility from Prime Minister Netanyahu when it comes to these end goals. They've been maximalist and absolutist, frankly, since the very beginning of the war, of no Hamas, which is hard to imagine, frankly, and returning all the hostages. And I think we're at a point where those goals are slightly in contradiction. That's not just Israel's fault, it's also Hamas's fault. I think for Hamas in Gaza, they actually wanted to restart the war. I think it's a positive for them because they think international opinion has turned so far against Israel that it will eventually help them to survive. And so both sides are in maximalist positions that are frankly going to be harmful to the hostages and obviously harmful to the people of Gaza ultimately.
I mean, speaking of Hamas, I mean, they have yet to respond militarily to the Israeli strikes, but you are expecting them to escalate attacks? Or, I mean, considering the humanitarian toll, is there any likelihood that Hamas could actually fold?
I think it's unlikely. It's not something that we've ever seen Hamas do in the past. I would expect the group to respond in the coming days as much as they can. One of the reasons you probably haven't seen a more robust response already is frankly the fact that the Israelis have taken out a significant amount of Hamas's rockets, of its capabilities, of its manufacturing of new rockets, some of its small arms. So it's not as easy as it was, say, in November of 2023 or even the first half of 2024. It is harder in the resupply, the routes in which you had the Iranians funneling weapons into Egypt eventually and then through the Rafah corridor are really closed. It's not going to be possible for that to happen. And so I think Hamas is squeezed, but I don't see collapse in their future. It's just not something that we've seen from the group before. And there's no reason to believe that they would be willing to give up now. They think in some ways they have the upper hand, that this will absolutely benefit them in the long run.
Okay, understood, Jonathan. Thank you very much for your insight this morning. Jonathan Panikoff, Director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council.